You may not be familiar with the name Robert Hammond, but in Sydney in the 1930s it was a different story. Pastor Hammond was well known for his work with the poor, and when the Great Depression hit our shores, he embarked on a bold experiment to provide land and homes to this city's most vulnerable. A new book called Faith in Action, which documents the work of Robert Hammond and the Hammond Cares charity, which grew from it, will be launched next week. Sharon O'Neill reports.
In the suburb of Hammondville, in the southwest of Sydney, an extraordinary reunion is taking place.
John Hatton, how you going?
You are something else, son. This man...
Did you bring your guitar?
I sent it to you last time at the school many years ago. Very proud of you, old son.
Is that right?
You're a good man.
You're a man of absolute wonderful taste, you realise that?
John Hatton is a former independent state MP and the man responsible for establishing the Woodroll Commission into police corruption in New South Wales. He's also a former resident of Hammondville.
This was a unique social experiment in Australia, if not in the world, by the vision of somebody we all regard with great emotion as a saint, Canon Hammond.
The shelter of homeless families, of whom there are nearly 5,000 in Sydney now, is the most acute problem that we are called upon to face.
When the Great Depression began in Sydney, Robert Hammond was working as an Anglican minister at St Barnabas Church in Broadway.
He was a great character, one of Sydney's great characters. He had a sharp wit, a generous heart and a really bold vision for helping the needy people of this city.
In brief, the idea of the pioneer home settlement is that unemployed and homeless families may obtain a 3-roomed house with a sleep-out veranda 30 feet by 6'6" and an acre of land for only 5 shillings a week.
In 1932, Robert Hammond cashed in his own life insurance and purchased several acres of land on the southwestern fringe of Sydney to build homes for evicted families facing life on the streets.
He had this great way of talking about it. He talked about a scheme that would save the woman from the fear of eviction, the man from the curse of doing nothing, and the children from the calamity of being undernourished.
As only families with children are accepted, this 5 shillings a week is paid from child endowment. That amount of money is more than counterbalanced by the vegetables, fruit and poultry which can be raised on the land. And at the end of 7 years, there will be no more payments, and the pioneer home builders will own their own homes in healthy surroundings.
My father was a rivet catcher on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. In 1932, of course, before the bridge opened in 1932, my father's job petered out. So he was unemployed, and it was in the courtroom when he was facing eviction that a police sergeant said, "Have you heard about Hammondville, Mr. Hatton?" And it was that seminal event that brought him to Hammondville in 1935.
The first houses at Hammondville were built by volunteers.
With the true Australian spirit of comradeship, they did magnificent work. Their only reward is the happiness that their voluntary labours will bring to people who have been living with the black fear of homelessness hanging over their heads.
So, George, this is your original house?
Yes, this is where I lived. Well, it's not quite where I lived as a child. I have a photo of it here, with the way it was when we moved into it. That's what Dad built from it, and there's a little 2-room shack.
As the Hammondville settlement grew, many of the lucky residents built their own homes, like George Payne's father.
And he's built it so well, and he was never a carpenter.
George Payne Sr. applied to come to Hammondville in 1937.
He was aged 28. His trade was a labourer, and Dad used to go away and work on the Warragamba Dam, and he'd be away all the week when he could get the work. And he'd come home on the weekends with his hands all bloody. It's hard to talk about. With his hands all bloody and he'd spend the weekend rubbing mutton fat into his hands so he could go back to work.
Robert Hammond gave the poor and destitute families of Sydney a second chance, and for those who grew up here, a life full of adventure.
To grow up in a town like this, we had a river full of fish, we had a dairy farm full of rabbits, mushrooms, we had, everyone grew vegetables, everyone had chooks, we had a swimming hole down the back, down there, everything you wanted.
We'd all go swimming in the creek. We never had a drowning in the whole place because all the kids looked after all the kids. The big kids looked after the little kids. It was just a very natural Huckleberry Fen existence. Wonderful.
Mum said she can always remember when we first came here, she said, oh, you cried and you kept saying, oh, the bites, the bites. She said we had so many mosquitoes, and she said it was a place of our own. We didn't know we were poor. You know, we had a wonderful life.
Well, they all had jobs building the church. And
much has changed in Hammondville, but fortunately, some things remain the same.
You know, it just looks the same as ever it did, doesn't it?
Stephen Judd, whose parents both worked with Robert Hammond, is now the chief executive of Hammond Care.
You know this place better than I do.
Yes.
And indeed the whole part of the suburb.
The charity Hammond Care evolved from the work of Robert Hammond and is now a leading provider for people living with dementia.
I guess I've always been inspired by people who take risks for people whose lives are at risk. And that's certainly part of the, I'd like to say that's part of the DNA of Hammond Care as well.
Well, most of the other houses ended up with a veranda on them, you know.
That book on Hammondville shows the importance of the standard that was set then. Look after the most vulnerable. Make the best of what you can. Look after your neighbour, right? And know how to relate to each other as a family and as a community, and carry that through into the retirement home, to the nursing home, to those people who are most disadvantaged with dementia, those people who didn't have the resources. And that's the jewel in Hammond Care that was lost in many institutions when they were looking at making a buck out of government policy. What is good, I think, is a lot of people did have nice gardens.
Yes,
and
yes.
this one's got beautiful roses.
They took the trouble, didn't they? Yeah. We could have been anywhere else in the middle of the city under much different circumstances. I think it's taken me to get this old to realise just how damn lucky we were to come here.